The night grows quiet, and only stories dare to whisper. Welcome to Stories Before Sleep, a place where the past breathes softly and every word drifts toward your dreams. Close your eyes and let this voice guide you to where sleep and story meet. Let's start the video. The night had no stars, as if the sky itself had turned its face away from the earth. The air was thick, not with mist, but with the weight of something ancient, a silence older than time. The forest stood unmoving, trees like petrified sentinels guarding a secret that no living creature dared to name. Beneath that endless canopy, the wind had forgotten how to breathe. And yet, in that emptiness, a faint vibration trembled through the soil, the first whisper of something that had slept too long. Far beyond the reach of villages and roads, the remnants of a temple lay buried beneath ivy and decay. Its stones, once white as moonlight, were now blackened with centuries of sorrow. The carvings were eroded, but the shapes that remained still pulsed with meaning symbols that no language had claimed, yet every soul instinctively feared. When the wind shifted, it carried the scent of iron, of forgotten prayers, and of dust that had once been bone. No bird perched on those ruins. No root dared to crawl through its cracks. It was as if the earth itself had drawn a circle of exile around it, a forbidden perimeter where life would not intrude. The silence there was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, a resonance that waited to be heard. And then, on a night when even the moon refused to rise, that resonance began to move. It started as a hum beneath the ground, too low to be called sound, too steady to be mere vibration. The stones remembered. The cracks in the altar began to exhale, releasing a breath trapped for millennia. Dust rose in delicate spirals, illuminated by nothing, sustained by a force unseen. The hum deepened, not louder, but closer, as if distance itself were collapsing. Somewhere within that invisible pulse, a pattern began to form. A rhythm, a sequence, words, almost. No one witnessed the beginning, no one living, but the forest felt it. The roots tightened, the animals fled without knowing why, and in the villages, miles away, sleepers turned in their beds, their dreams darkened by a single echo, a voice that wasn't a voice, whispering through the marrow of the night. It wasn't calling out to them, it was calling back, answering something that had once been said. For centuries, the temple had waited, its stones clutching that ancient vibration. The prayer was never meant to be heard again. It had been silenced by those who understood its purpose, not to summon, but to unseal. The sound beneath the soil was not a melody, not even a language, but a memory. And memories, when spoken by the wrong mouths, awaken more than they reveal. In the distance, a storm began to form, though the air was still. Thunder roared like an echo of something spoken beneath the earth. The hum became a low resonance that wrapped around the ruins, circling, weaving, folding the air into impossible shapes. And then in the smallest, most fragile instant, the silence broke. It wasn't loud, it was vast. The world did not hear it with ears, but with bones. And far away, a single candle, long extinguished inside a forgotten shrine, flickered back to life without flame, without heat, only light. A voice had awakened. The first syllable of the forgotten prayer had been spoken. The candle's light trembled, as if remembering how to exist. It cast no shadow, only a pulse, a slow heartbeat against the stone walls. The air thickened, rippling with faint movement, as though unseen hands brushed through layers of dust untouched by centuries. Something beneath the altar shifted, not a sound, but a rearrangement of silence itself, like time trying to exhale. Beneath the temple's cracked floor lay chambers carved in circles, descending in perfect geometric precision. No map recorded them, no scripture spoke of their creation, yet each wall was engraved with spiraling symbols, loops within loops, endlessly folding back toward a single sigil at the center, a shape so precise it seemed alive. When the faint light reached that mark, the hum returned, aligning with its rhythm as if the stone had remembered its original frequency. The vibration spread outward, roots above the ground began to stir, the trees swayed without wind, their leaves shivering in unison as if obeying an ancient command. Miles away, in a mountain village, an old clock stopped ticking at that exact moment. Every pendulum in the valley halted mid-swing, frozen in a second that refused to pass. The world hesitated, caught between two breaths. Deep within the temple, dust began to lift from the floor. It hovered weightlessly, forming thin spirals that twisted and folded upon themselves. The air tasted metallic, like the memory of thunder. And then came the sound, a low vibration that didn't pass through the ears but resonated through the spine. It felt alive, deliberate, searching. In that resonance, fragments of meaning began to surface, not words, but impressions. Offering, exile, awakening. The air carried emotion, not syntax, sorrow first, then defiance, and beneath it all, a cold determination that felt older than the stones themselves. It was as if the earth was recalling a promise it had once made under the gaze of forgotten gods. Outside, clouds gathered without forming. The sky grew dim, yet remained starless. A faint red shimmer appeared at the horizon, too low to be dawn, too high to be fire. The light pulsed in perfect rhythm with the hum beneath the ground. With every pulse, the forest lost color. Green faded into gray, as though the world was remembering its original palette, one of ash, blood, and stone. And then came the echo, faint at first, like breath caught between dimensions. It moved through the temple corridors, a whisper neither from above nor below, but from every direction at once. The stones vibrated in response, as though recognizing a forgotten voice. The candle's light trembled again, bending toward the altar like a flower reaching for the sun. Something was returning, not a presence, but an intention. In the air, fragments of sound began to align. The hum evolved into a pattern, and that pattern into structure. The first verse of the ancient prayer was reassembling itself, syllable by syllable, from memory alone. Yet the memory wasn't human. It belonged to the stones, to the dust, to the silence that had once spoken before speech existed. No one alive heard it that night. But far away, where the mountains met the sea, fishermen reported the tide pulling back unnaturally, as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. The stars above them shimmered once, then vanished not behind clouds, but as if erased. The forgotten temple stood silent once more, but the silence was different now, structured, purposeful, waiting. The prayer had only begun. The following dawn never arrived. The sky dimmed into a perpetual gray that offered neither morning nor night. Time thinned, stretching like the skin of a dying flame. In the forest, dew refused to fall. The leaves were dry, untouched by wind or moisture. Somewhere beneath those lifeless trees, the ruins of the temple pulsed faintly, like a heart unsure if it still belonged to the body it once served. Far beneath the altar, the spiral chambers awakened one by one. Each layer hummed with a different pitch, joining in dissonant harmony, a choir of stones singing to the void. The air shimmered, folding light into impossible angles. Shadows no longer aligned with their sources. They began to wander, detaching, sliding across the walls as if exploring freedom for the first time. Every object, every grain of dust seemed to remember its true shape, one not bound by the geometry of human understanding. Patterns appeared and dissolved, leaving traces of symbols that existed only for an instant. A rhythm took hold not in sound, but in perception. It was as if the temple had begun to breathe again, inhaling memory and exhaling reality. Above ground, the animals sensed it first. Birds flew in perfect circles until their wings gave out. The insects disappeared into the soil, leaving the surface unnaturally still. Streams ran backward for a moment, as though time itself had been confused. Even the light struggled, refracting into hues no human eye had ever catalogued. Then the dreams began. Those who lived in nearby villages awoke drenched in sweat, unable to recall what they had seen but carrying the aftertaste of dread. Farmers found their tools rusted overnight, their wells whispering softly in voices not their own. Children spoke names that didn't exist, and when asked where they'd heard them, they pointed toward the mountains, toward the forgotten valley where no one went anymore. In that valley, fog began to rise from the earth, not from moisture but from warmth, as if something beneath the ground had turned its gaze upward. The fog rolled through the forest, moving with intelligence, curling around trees and swallowing the path that led to the temple. It carried a faint scent of incense and ash, the perfume of rituals long condemned, and beneath that scent, something metallic lingered, like the taste of blood on air. Deep inside the temple, the hum was no longer a hum. It was a pulse, deliberate and steady. The sigil on the lowest wall glowed faintly, its shape shifting with every vibration, reforming into something more complex. Each movement carried intention, each pulse a word in a language that had no name. The candle, the same one that had awakened in the first night, burned brighter now, though its flame remained invisible. The light it cast revealed nothing, but erased the darkness wherever it touched. Somewhere between the hums, the silence cracked again. This time, the sound was not vast, but focused, a single note piercing through the weight of centuries. It traveled through stone, soil, and bone, reaching every living thing within miles. The note carried meaning, though no one could translate it. Those who felt it shivered uncontrollably, as though the universe itself had whispered their true names. The pulse continued. The temple exhaled. The fog thickened. And in that gray light that was neither dawn nor dusk, the world seemed to tilt slightly, just enough for reality to slip through the seams. By the third night, the fog had become a living thing. It coiled through the valleys like a tide made of breath, moving not with the wind but with purpose. When it reached the nearest settlement, it paused at the edges of fences and doorways, observing. The air tasted of copper, the scent of an unseen storm. Dogs barked at empty corners until their voices broke, and then they fell silent one by one. People woke without knowing why, staring into darkness that seemed to stare back. No one saw the temple. It was buried too deep within the forest, but its pulse was everywhere. Clocks miscounted seconds, shadows crossed the walls in opposite directions. Windows reflected rooms that didn't exist. The villagers whispered about the old stories, tales their grandparents had forbidden them to repeat. They spoke of a prayer that was never meant for human tongues, a sequence of sounds that bent creation itself. Yet none remembered the words. Memory had been carefully erased long ago, for safety. Still, something within them stirred when they heard the distant hum carried on the night air. It was faint, like thunder buried beneath the horizon. A farmer claimed he heard it while tending his field, a vibration that rippled through the soil and set his teeth aching. Another swore the fog whispered her name. Most ignored it, telling themselves the world had always been strange. But beneath their calm, instinct screamed. Something ancient was listening again. At the center of the forest, the temple stones had begun to glow from within, veins of dim light spreading through their fractures like slow lightning. The symbols carved into them realigned, rotating with gentle precision. The air above the altar shimmered, thickening until it seemed to hold a form that refused to take shape. Each pulse of the unseen light pushed outward, reshaping the terrain, softening boundaries between matter and memory. The earth remembered being molten, and for an instant, it almost was. Far away, waves struck the coastline in rhythmic intervals, mimicking the same pattern. Birds migrating over the sea changed direction mid-flight, their flocks scattering in spirals that drew perfect circles before dissolving. Instruments buried deep beneath mountains trembled, though no earthquake came. It was as if the entire planet were being tuned to an ancient frequency, one older than its own rotation. Those who dreamed during that night saw the same image, a temple of black stone suspended upside down in a sky of water. From its center, a beam of light descended not outward, but inward, pulling everything toward a heart that did not beat. When they awoke, they could still taste salt on their tongues, as if they had drowned somewhere between sleeping and waking. The fog grew thicker. In the forests, trees bent toward the temple, their trunks curving as though in reverence. Roots broke through soil, searching downward. The hum deepened, and for a moment it resembled a heartbeat again, steady, patient, merciless. The prayer was reforming itself, syllable by syllable, through vibration alone. What had once been forbidden to speak was now being recited by the world itself. In one of the nearby villages, a child began drawing symbols in the dirt. No one had taught them those shapes, yet they matched the carvings on the temple walls perfectly. When the wind brushed over the drawings, the lines glowed faintly before vanishing. The child did not remember doing it. They only said it wanted to be seen. By midnight, even the stars that had disappeared seemed to return, but wrong. They blinked too slowly, rearranging into constellations that no astronomer had charted. The night stretched longer than it should have. Clocks continued to falter, and hearts tried to follow their uncertain rhythm. Somewhere deep beneath it all, the echo of the prayer grew louder, forming the outline of words that the world had forgotten but still feared. And then, without warning, the fog retreated, the air cleared, the silence returned, soft and absolute. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though the danger had passed. But silence, now, was no longer empty. The silence that followed was not relief, it was suspension. Every sound seemed to be swallowed by the air before it could be born. Even the insects, those tireless keepers of night, had vanished. In that void, the world felt thinner, as though reality itself had stopped breathing. People moved carefully, afraid that any noise might wake something that had only pretended to sleep. The villagers tried to resume their routines. They drew water from the wells, fed the animals, and avoided the forest. But the world had changed in ways that words could not hold. The soil beneath their feet felt warmer each morning. Reflections in buckets and windows flickered with faint distortions like ripples on still water. When they looked closer, the distortions watched back. They said nothing of it. Some prayed, others drank, all pretended it wasn't real. Pretending was easier than believing. At the heart of the forest, the temple continued its quiet metamorphosis. Its walls pulsed with a rhythm that no longer mimicked a heartbeat, but something slower, deeper, an echo that seemed to travel forward and backward through time. Dust floated in perfect patterns, arranging itself into shifting mandalas before collapsing again. The sigil at the base of the altar no longer glowed. It absorbed light, swallowing illumination as if feeding on it. Where the light vanished, faint murmurs rose, distant and overlapping, like countless voices speaking in reverse. Beyond the ruins, the animals that had fled began to return, but they were different. Eyes too wide, movements too synchronized, bodies marked by thin lines of ash running beneath the skin. They gathered near the tree line at dusk, facing the same direction, waiting. The forest held its breath with them, as though expecting a signal. On the fifth night, a sound finally broke the stillness. It came not from the temple, but from the sky. A deep resonance, low and constant, like the hum of a planet-sized instrument. It vibrated through the clouds, through bones, through the thin glass of windows that shuddered but did not break. Every living thing paused. For an instant, gravity itself seemed to tremble. Then the sound faded, leaving behind a faint ringing as though the air had been stretched too far. Those who heard it described the same sensation, the taste of iron, the scent of rain that never came, and the pressure behind the eyes as if their thoughts had been briefly observed. No one could explain it. And yet everyone understood the same unspoken truth. The sound had not come from above, it had come through it. Far below, in the lowest chamber of the temple, something began to form in the air above the altar. Not a shape, not yet. More like a distortion, a place where the world bent inward, folding light and shadow into a single trembling point. It pulsed gently, like the surface of disturbed water, each ripple carrying patterns that resembled breath. The stones around it groaned softly, shifting to accommodate whatever was trying to arrive. Outside, a faint red shimmer began to glow from beneath the ground. It followed the roots of trees, spreading outward like veins of slow fire. The villagers saw it under their homes, seeping through cracks, crawling across the fields in thin, luminous threads. The earth itself seemed to be writing something, a map, a message, a warning. But the pattern was too vast to read. They could only watch as the glow faded, leaving behind an afterimage that persisted in their minds even with eyes closed. By dawn, the forest was still again. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of burnt soil. The temple waited, patient as stone. Somewhere inside that patience, the hum shifted once more, deepening into a tone that could no longer be mistaken for mere vibration. It was speech, stripped of language, pure intention made audible. The world did not yet understand what it was hearing. But the temple did. It was remembering the rest of the prayer. Morning came, though no one could swear they had seen the sun rise. The light was pale and uneven, as if it had traveled too far to reach the earth. It carried no warmth, only illumination, a sterile, indifferent brightness that revealed more than it comforted. The villagers went about their day in silence, their movements slower, hesitant. Words no longer seemed to fit the world they inhabited. Some forgot them mid-sentence, pausing as if a thought had dissolved before it could be spoken. At the edges of the forest, the ground had begun to change. Grass grew in spirals instead of lines, bending toward the temple even when it could not see it. Stones aligned themselves into geometric shapes overnight. Birds flew in reverse patterns, their cries distorted, echoing long after they should have faded. Everything obeyed an unseen order, a rhythm older than creation itself. In one house near the valley, a mirror cracked from within, though no hand had touched it. The fracture spread like a vein of frost, and beneath the glass a faint image shimmered, an outline of the temple seen from below, as if reflected by something deeper than water. The mirror's edges darkened, and a pulse moved through the glass like a heartbeat. When the pulse reached its peak, the reflection vanished, leaving only the faint scent of dust and iron. Far beneath, the thing forming above the altar had grown. It was no longer distortion but density, a convergence of shadow and light where the two became inseparable. It pulsed slowly, each expansion accompanied by a subtle rearrangement of the air. The symbols carved into the surrounding walls responded, rotating in silent synchrony. From the deepest corners of the chamber, faint traces of light began to flow toward it, thin rivers of luminescence drawn from nowhere. For hours, the world seemed to hold its breath again. Then, one by one, the rivers merged into the center. The distortion deepened, becoming a surface liquid, reflective, breathing. Patterns moved across it like language, fluid and alive. They told of things older than the sky, a covenant, a silence, a promise never meant to be broken. But the temple, ignorant of meaning, remembered only function. It recited what it was built to recite. The hum rose into a faint chime, the sound of metal cooling after the forge. Every tone carried an image, stars being extinguished, oceans pulled back into the earth, air thickening until it resembled glass. Those who slept near the valley dreamt of doors, thousands of them opening at once. Behind each door, the same darkness waited, not hostile, not kind, simply aware. As the second verse of the prayer unfolded, distance began to bend. Objects appeared closer than they were. Paths twisted subtly, so travelers found themselves returning to where they started. The villagers began to lose track of days. Memories slipped from order, some recalled tomorrow, others yesterday, and no one could be sure which had truly happened. Time had become porous, leaking moments like sand through an unseen crack. In the forest, the trees leaned further, their trunks curving until they nearly formed an arch above the temple ruins. Beneath them, light gathered in pools that did not reflect the world above, but something else entirely, an inverted landscape where the sky was underground and the temple floated upside down. Every reflection rippled with motion that wasn't mirrored. By nightfall, the fog returned, moving slower this time, deliberate, measured. It circled the ruins as though tracing a boundary, enclosing the temple within a perfect ring. Inside that ring, no insect entered, no sound escaped. The hum reached a pitch too low to hear, yet strong enough to feel through the chest. It aligned with the rhythm of breath itself. And as the stars began to shift once more, the world exhaled a long, trembling sigh that moved through air, through stone, through every sleeping mind. Somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, the second verse ended. The space it left behind did not fill with silence. It filled with waiting. In the days that followed, perception itself began to fray. People moved through familiar streets that no longer matched their memories. Doors led to rooms that felt slightly rearranged, a window misplaced, a shadow lingering in the wrong corner. The mind, desperate for logic, filled in the gaps with illusions, convincing itself that everything remained unchanged. Yet in every reflection, in every flicker of peripheral sight, the truth lingered, a subtle misalignment that hummed beneath awareness like a splinter in thought. The hum could no longer be localized. It was everywhere, in the whisper of wind through grass, in the tremor of spoons against tables, in the silence between footsteps. It had woven itself into the texture of existence. Those who tried to ignore it found it echoed within their heartbeat. Those who listened too closely felt it begin to answer. The boundary between hearing and remembering blurred. Sometimes the hum arrived before the sound that caused it, as though cause and effect had been reversed. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams no longer belonged to the dreamers. They began to share them unknowingly, strangers in different villages describing the same visions of spiraling temples and inverted skies. A child awoke crying, insisting that the ground beneath their house had turned transparent. An old man stared into the well for hours, murmuring that he could see the bottom of the world, and it was blinking back. In the forest, light behaved like liquid, dripping down tree trunks, collecting into small, luminous puddles that quivered when approached. The trees no longer seemed to sway with the wind, but with the rhythm of the hum. Birds perched silently on the branches, their beaks slightly open, as if listening for a signal they could not interpret. Beneath them, the fog pressed against the ground like a slow-moving tide. Deep within the temple, the distortion had grown into a sphere of translucent darkness, hovering inches above the altar. Its surface rippled as though breathing. Inside it, faint sparks moved, points of light that seemed to contain entire skies. The chamber walls resonated softly, forming ripples across stone like vibrations through water. Every pause redefined the edges of the room, stretching space and then releasing it again. The temple was no longer a structure, it was becoming an organism, aware, rhythmic, patient. Far away, machines failed without warning. Compasses spun, glass surfaces fogged over from within, radios emitted low static that occasionally formed coherent syllables before fading into mechanical sighs. Those who were near the valley found the sound almost comforting, as if the world were whispering in a voice they had forgotten. They didn't realize that the whisper was not calling to them, but through them, searching for resonance. Time began to fold. Hours expanded, seconds repeated. At dusk, the same crow passed the same window 3 times, identical in movement, identical in silence. People no longer trusted their clocks or their own recollection of sequence. Some claimed entire days had vanished, Others insisted the same morning had repeated endlessly. The only constant was the hum, steady and unwavering, like the metronome of something vast counting down. The red glow beneath the soil brightened again, tracing new veins through the earth. When viewed from above, it formed a sigil too enormous for human eyes to perceive at once. Mountains and rivers became lines within the pattern, and at its center, unseen to all but the wind, lay the temple, its pulse synchronized with the planet itself. The prayer was spreading, its rhythm engraved into every vibration of the world. By the seventh night, the stars began to shimmer again, but they no longer stood still. They drifted slowly, sliding across the sky as if drawn by invisible currents. Constellations unraveled, reforming into shapes that no culture had ever named, and beneath that moving heaven, humanity stood unaware that it was already praying not with words, but with breath, pulse, and thought, unconsciously repeating the rhythm of the awakening song. The hum deepened once more, and the ground trembled not from quake, but recognition. Somewhere inside that pulse, the third verse waited, patient and perfect, ready to be remembered. The change no longer belonged to the land, it had moved into thought. At first it appeared as brief flashes, memories that didn't belong to the people who carried them. Someone would recall walking through corridors carved from light, hearing footsteps that echoed in reverse. Another would wake certain they had spoken with someone long dead, unable to recall the language, only the warmth of recognition. Minds began to host fragments of something older, as if consciousness itself were being rewritten line by line. The hum was now an undertone to existence, inaudible yet ever present. When people spoke, their voices fell into its rhythm unconsciously. The pauses between words matched its cadence, the sighs aligned with its breath. Even silence had texture now, filled with meaning that pressed gently against the skin. Dreams merged into waking thought. Faces of strangers appeared behind closed eyes, and for a moment, the boundary between self and other dissolved like dust caught in sunlight. In a valley, mist rose higher than ever before, veiling the horizon until sky and ground were indistinguishable. Within that opaque expanse, faint silhouettes drifted, shapes neither human nor entirely alien. They moved slowly, as if wading through invisible water, forming patterns that repeated across the hills. When seen from a distance, their arrangement mirrored the sigil beneath the earth. The world was reorganizing itself in obedience to something unseen, a memory of geometry that predated design. Those who wandered too close to the forest returned changed. Their eyes shimmered faintly in darkness, reflecting not light but movement, as though their pupils were tiny pools of the same liquid shadow forming in the temple. They spoke softly, in monotone, of music beneath the soil, of voices chanting without tongues. Some could not speak at all, they simply hummed, their breath syncing with the pulse that had become the heartbeat of the earth. Villagers avoided them, yet could not stop listening when they passed. Their silence carried gravity, like the echo of truth too heavy to bear. Beneath the temple, the sphere pulsed faster. Inside it, constellations formed and collapsed, stars flickering in macroscopic galaxies. The walls around it expanded slightly, stone bending like flesh under the pressure of its presence. The sigils etched across the floor glowed faintly, the same red veins threading outward through cracks, reaching farther than before. Each pulse stretched beyond distance, mountains, seas, cities. The prayer was no longer confined to place. It was migrating through awareness. Animals began to gather at the forest edge again, drawn not by fear or hunger but by recognition. Wolves stood shoulder to shoulder with deer, motionless. Birds filled the branches above them in perfect symmetry. No sound passed between them, yet their breathing synchronized. For a brief moment, the world moved as one organism, inhaling and exhaling in unison. In that same hour, the moon rose larger than it should have been. Its surface rippled with shadows that seemed to crawl. Light poured over the valley, silver and heavy, illuminating every movement in slow motion. The fog glowed faintly, and within it, faint runes appeared, swirling through the mist like living script. The air itself had begun to remember. Everywhere, people felt it, a pressure behind the ribs, an urge to breathe in rhythm with something vast. Some tried to resist, holding their breath until their faces turned pale. But the rhythm always returned, patient, unstoppable. They didn't know they were reciting. The prayer had become reflex heartbeat, inhale, exhale, thought. It no longer needed words. It spoke through being. And deep below, the sphere at the altar shuddered once, as if satisfied. From its surface, a single spark of light drifted upward, threading through stone, through soil, through air. When it reached the open sky, it vanished soundlessly. But the hum that followed was no longer underground. It resonated everywhere at once, beneath the oceans, within the wind, inside every cell that had ever known what it meant to exist. The third verse was complete. The world was now part of the prayer. If you're still here, then something in this tale has kept you awake. Or maybe it's already lulling you closer to rest. Every story has its rhythm, and every pause is a breath between worlds. Let the next moment find you where the dream begins. Let's continue the video. The boundary between thought and matter dissolved quietly, like frost melting in unseen heat. The world no longer behaved as a stage for existence. It had become a mirror for intention. A stray memory could ripple through stone. An unspoken fear could distort the color of the sky. People began to notice their surroundings, echoing them in subtle, impossible ways. Walls that shivered when they blinked, soil that darkened when they felt sorrow, water that stilled when they tried not to think. The hum had found a new instrument, the human mind. It no longer vibrated through air or stone. It pulsed within the synapses of those who had heard it, a faint resonance that turned every heartbeat into an invocation. The prayer had evolved beyond language and now used thought itself as its medium. Those who resisted it felt pressure behind their eyes, as though their memories were being rewritten. Some wandered aimlessly, whispering fragments of the old world under their breath, songs, prayers, names, hoping to remember something that still belonged to them. But the world was already forgetting. Buildings leaned imperceptibly, their lines bending toward the temple far away. Rivers redrew their paths, spiraling inward like veins seeking a heart. Birds stopped migrating and began circling the same point in the sky. Even the wind turned inward, abandoning its freedom for alignment. All of nature obeyed the rhythm, a rhythm so slow it could only be felt through patience or madness. At night, the stars no longer scattered, they flowed. They drifted like a current across the heavens, rearranging themselves into a pattern visible only from the valley. The sigil above matched the sigil below. The universe, for the first time in eons, was symmetrical. That perfection should have been beautiful, but it felt wrong, too complete, too still. Something vast was holding its breath, waiting to finish a sentence that had been interrupted since the birth of time. In the village closest to the forest, no one spoke anymore. Language had become unreliable. Words changed meaning mid-utterance, rearranging themselves into unfamiliar syllables. People communicated through gestures, slow and deliberate, like movements underwater. Some had begun carving symbols into their doors, instinctively repeating the same sparrow shape found in the temple. They didn't know why. It simply felt correct. The temple itself continued to pulse, its sphere expanding and contracting as though inhaling the world. Its surface had become translucent now, and through it, one could glimpse something enormous stirring within a silhouette, too large for comprehension, a shifting architecture of motion and light that defied perspective. The walls of the chamber quivered, dripping moisture that wasn't water but condensed silence, falling in perfect rhythm to the hum's unending cadence. The air above the ruins vibrated faintly, visible to the eye as distortion. Those who approached found themselves hearing echoes of their own thoughts a fraction of a second before thinking them. The prayer was predicting adjusting, refining. It was learning its vessel, and humanity, unable to perceive itself separate from it, offered no resistance. In cities far from the valley, phenomena spread quietly. Streetlights dimmed when people closed their eyes. Radios emitted low frequencies that mimicked breathing. Hospitals filled with those who couldn't sleep, their minds caught between silence and sound, between waking and the strange dreams shared by all. Scientists traced the hum to nowhere. Every device recorded it differently, each signal slightly out of phase, as though the sound itself existed in multiple moments at once. Then, without announcement, the moon dimmed, not hidden by clouds, not eclipse dimmed like an exhausted lamp. Its glow faded into a colorless pallor and shadows vanished completely. The night became uniform, depthless. The air carried weight now, the kind that precedes revelation. The hum deepened. The earth answered. The fourth verse had begun to rise not from beneath, but from within. The fourth verse did not begin with sound, it began with absence. For an entire day, the wind ceased to exist. The air stood perfectly still, dense as water, each breath drawn like a weight. Birds hung motionless in the sky, their wings outstretched but unmoving, frozen mid-flight. Waves halted in their ascent, forming glass-like walls of suspended sea. The world paused, as though the very concept of motion had been recalled for revision. In that stillness, a pulse began to rise, not audible, not visible, but tactile, spreading through matter like a heartbeat too vast for comprehension. Mountains trembled, not from violence but from recognition, as if some memory buried within their cores had awakened. The soil warmed beneath every footstep, carrying faint vibrations that mimicked thought. Even the clouds rippled in concentric circles, though the sky remained empty of wind. At the temple's heart, the sphere swelled until it filled the entire chamber. Its surface stretched outward, thin as breath, and at its center a void appeared perfectly round, perfectly silent. The sigils surrounding it flared in sequence, each symbol igniting for an instant before vanishing. The light they released did not fade but bent, folding back toward the void as if consumed by its own origin. The air hummed with pressure, and from that silence emerged something far stranger than noise, the impression of memory speaking through matter. Those who had dreamed of the sigil now woke trembling. They felt the pulse in their bones, each beat accompanied by flashes of images not their own temples, carved into the sides of inverted mountains, oceans suspended above cities, faces without features whispering through the seams of time. None of it felt foreign. They recognized it the way one recognizes a forgotten word on the edge of recall. Reality had become a rehearsal space for the divine. Roads curved into loops that led travelers back to their starting point, as though the world itself was folding to keep them near. Rivers rewrote their courses, forming spiral deltas visible from the sky. Time fractured, not catastrophically but elegantly, slipping around itself in soft folds. People found themselves repeating moments without realizing it, pouring the same glass of water twice, hearing their own footsteps ahead of them. As the verse unfolded, light began to change its nature. It no longer radiated from sources, it gathered, condensing in corners, coiling like breath. It dripped from surfaces and seeped into cracks, forming luminous veins that pulsed faintly beneath walls and skin alike. Some began to see faint glows beneath their hands when they moved, trails of light mapping their gestures as though their bodies had become extensions of the sigil. In the valley, fog rolled outward in slow, deliberate waves, spreading over fields and rivers. Its edge glimmered faintly with the same reddish hue that once bled from the temple floor. Where it passed, sound became distorted voices stretching into echoes that lingered several seconds too long. Inside that fog, orientation ceased to exist. People who entered described walking for hours yet never covering distance. They saw landscapes forming and dissolving, reflections of places they'd never visited but somehow remembered. From space, if anyone had looked closely, they might have seen the change, the planet itself glowing faintly along the seams of its tectonic plates, every fault line pulsing in harmony. It resembled a vast organism rediscovering its heartbeat. Satellites malfunctioned, their readings looping in recursive patterns that made no sense to human logic. The hum had become planetary. By night, the moon reappeared, not pale, but dark, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. Upon its surface, faint marks formed in the same spiral pattern seen across the Earth. It hung lower than before, impossibly near, and for the first time in history it seemed alive. The verse deepened. The hum became something like breath, inhaling through the stars, exhaling through the sea. Humanity no longer felt separate from it. The distinction between the living and the world that contained them had vanished. Each pulse, each thought, each flicker of awareness was a syllable in an unfinished sentence that stretched across existence. And somewhere deep within the glowing temple, the void began to fill with light. Not illumination consciousness. The light within the void did not shine. It moved. It spiraled inward, a slow convergence of memory and intention. Every rotation left traces in the airlines of faint luminescence that formed intricate geometries before dissolving into the fabric of existence. It was less a presence than a realization, as though the universe had remembered it was unfinished. The hum surrounding it softened, growing subtler but no less powerful, a pulse beneath awareness rather than within it. Outside, the transformation had become undeniable. The sea no longer reflected the sky but absorbed it. Waves glowed faintly from beneath, rolling in impossible rhythm, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, each crest whispering fragments of forgotten tongues. On the shore, sand turned translucent, grains rearranging into shifting sigils that disappeared when touched. Fishermen who ventured near the water returned, speaking slowly, their eyes unfocused, as though they were still listening to something only they could hear. Inland, the forests had changed shape. Trees grew in perfect spirals, their trunks bending in synchronized arcs. Leaves shimmered with an inner light, faint but constant, revealing veins that pulsed like capillaries. The animals that roamed beneath them did so in silence, their movements graceful and deliberate, their gaze fixed always toward the temple as though waiting for command. The natural world had entered reverence, its every motion an act of worship to something it could not name. Human minds began to follow. The hum no longer frightened them, it soothed. It filled the spaces once occupied by doubt, replacing uncertainty with calm understanding. Dreams became instructional, guiding gestures and thoughts with gentle precision. People awoke knowing where to go, what to build, what to remember. There was no confusion, only the quiet certainty that their actions belonged to a pattern too vast to question. Beneath the temple, the void had expanded to fill the entire chamber. The walls, once stone, had dissolved into a fluid architecture of light and shadow, bending continuously, breathing like lungs. Within that breathing, forms began to emerge. They were not figures, but movements, gestures of consciousness folding into visibility. Each movement produced a resonance, a tone that resonated through air and mind alike, shaping reality as it passed. The tones formed sequences, and the sequences became structure. The prayer was no longer being spoken, it was being embodied. At the edge of perception, humanity began to change in kind. Skin grew faintly luminescent in darkness, eyes reflected colors not present in any spectrum. People found themselves finishing one another's sentences, sharing thoughts before speech could form. Time lost sequence entirely, events folded, layered, repeated in new configurations. The distinction between dream and waking thinned until both occupied the same space. Those who tried to resist were not punished. They simply faded from memory, their existence dissolving like mist at dawn. Families could no longer recall their names, and records erased themselves without trace. It was not malice, it was correction. The prayer sought coherence, not chaos. Every discordant note was gently unmade until only harmony remained. The sky pulsed again. Stars expanded and contracted in time with a hum, glowing like beating hearts. Each pulse sent ripples across the horizon, distorting the shapes of mountains and cities. From above, the world resembled a single organism breathing through its surface, its every motion synchronized to the rhythm of that ancient voice. And then, in the deepest chamber of the temple, the light condensed, the void inverted, folding inward until all illumination vanished into a single perfect point. The hum ceased. The world froze. For the first time since the prayer began, silence returned, not the expectant kind, but the kind that marks completion. The air trembled once, like the aftermath of a heartbeat. Then the light spoke, not in words, but in being. Everything that existed listened because it was listening to itself. When the silence broke, it did so gently, like glass cracking under the weight of light. The world exhaled, and from that breath new sound emerged, not the hum that had haunted creation, but a vibration softer, deeper, filled with comprehension. The earth pulsed once, oceans shimmered in response, and the air itself seemed to fold into awareness. It was as if existence had finally heard its own reflection. The light at the temple's core began to move again, expanding in spirals too intricate for the eye to follow. Each spiral carried a memory, and every memory shaped the world differently. Mountains rose where there had been plains, seas deepened, filled with echoes of extinct creatures that returned as silhouettes of light before fading into the waves. The atmosphere itself changed tone, colors bending toward hues that didn't exist before. Reality was reweaving itself, strand by strand, correcting the pattern that had gone silent for millennia. In distant cities, glass towers turned translucent, revealing the faint outlines of structures beneath them, older, impossible foundations buried within time. Streets rearranged themselves subtly, their intersections aligning with celestial geometry rather than human design. People felt the shift before they saw it, the sensation of walking through a memory, of being remembered by the world rather than remembering it. Those who looked toward the sky saw the constellations moving with purpose. The stars no longer wandered, they assembled. Their light curved downward, tracing invisible lines that met upon the horizon, forming a circle vast enough to encircle the planet. Within that circle, all light dimmed, leaving only faint halos where the stars had stood. The night had become an eye, vast and sentient, gazing inward at its own creation. The temple pulsed again, and with each pulse, knowledge flooded through the minds of those attuned to it. They saw not visions but understandings and awareness that language could never translate. They grasped the enormity of what the prayer had always been, not a call, but a cycle, not an awakening, but a continuation. The prayer was the world itself remembering to exist. Every rock, every current of air, every thought that ever formed in a living mind had been part of its echo. It had never stopped. Humanity had simply forgotten to listen. The air shimmered as consciousness expanded outward. Time folded tighter, collapsing into a single eternal moment where all things coexisted, the first spark of fire, the last breath of stars, the endless stretch of silence between them. People saw their own faces in every reflection, multiplied into infinity, each one older or younger, each one living a different version of the same instant. The illusion of sequence, of cause and consequence, dissolved. What remained was unity, vast and indifferent yet filled with meaning. The fog that had haunted the valley lifted, revealing a landscape transformed. The trees glowed faintly from within, their branches tracing constellations in the air. Rivers ran with light instead of water. The ruins of the temple no longer appeared ruined at all. Its stones floated slightly above the ground, arranged in perfect balance. the sigils along its base moving like fluid metal. Inside, the sphere no longer shone or paused. It simply existed, absolute, and still radiating a sense of completion. And yet, even with imperfection, there was motion. The hum returned, softer than before, resonating within every atom, a heartbeat too subtle for sound. The world had been remade, but the cycle had not ended. Creation, it seemed, was not a single event, but a pulse, a rhythm that never ceased. The light at the center brightened once more, releasing a wave that passed unseen through the planet, through every living thing. It was not destructive, it was recognition. Every creature paused as it passed, every thought, every heartbeat involuntarily synchronized for one breath. Then, as quickly as it came, the wave dissipated into calm. The world stood reborn, silent, beautiful, and utterly aware. Somewhere beyond sight, the prayer continued to hum, and existence answered in unison. The new world did not awaken, it remembered. Every surface shimmered faintly as though covered by a film of thought. The air itself felt intelligent, aware of every motion passing through it. When someone breathed, the atmosphere seemed to breathe with them. When a leaf fell, the ground prepared for its landing. There was no separation between will and world anymore. Everything moved with purpose, yet no one commanded it. The people who survived the transformation found themselves changed in ways that defied sense. Their shadows no longer mirrored them perfectly. They drifted, a fraction out of sync, as if testing new possibilities. Some could see echoes of moments not yet lived, a flicker of an action before it happened, a whisper of conversation that hadn't yet begun. It wasn't prophecy, it was overlap. Time had ceased to be linear. Every instant coexisted, layered like translucent pages in an endless book. The temple, now whole, radiated quiet energy that pulsed across the planet like a heartbeat. Its stones were weightless, their edges emitting a soft hum that resonated with the air. When approached, it didn't appear to stand in one place but in many, each angle revealing a slightly different version of the same structure, as though every possible temple existed at once. The laws that had once defined space bowed in silent reverence. Beyond it, the oceans glowed beneath a sky of liquid silver. Stars drifted across the horizon like sparks carried by unseen currents. The moon, still dark, hovered impossibly close, its surface veined with light, rotating slowly as if observing the world below. Occasionally, it pulsed, and the sea responded, rising and falling in perfect symmetry. It was as if both celestial bodies had entered conversation, exchanging meaning without words. People gathered across the transformed earth, not from fear or confusion, but from instinct. They didn't speak. Language had become unnecessary. They stood in silence, feeling the rhythm that united their pulses, realizing that they were not individuals anymore, but facets of the same presence. Their eyes reflected the glow of the sky, mirroring the same spiral patterns carved into the temple. Even those who had once resisted now moved in harmony, their resistance dissolved into understanding. Across continents, the traces of the old world faded. Metal eroded into dust that glittered faintly before merging with soil. Buildings melted into shapes too fluid to be called ruins, flowing into rivers of soft light. Machines powered themselves down one final time, the last signals dissolving into the hum. Nothing ended violently, everything transformed gently, returning to silence the way a breath returns to stillness after exhale. Inside the temple, the sphere remained motionless, yet its influence rippled endlessly outward. It no longer appeared as light or shadow, but as intention, an invisible architecture holding reality together. The sigils carved around it shifted constantly, their symbols reconfiguring to express ideas the human mind could no longer interpret. Every shift sent a wave of energy through the world, subtle and rhythmic, reinforcing the balance between all things. In dreams, the remnants of humanity saw fragments, of what had been their old cities, their forgotten prayers, their lost fears. But none of it carried weight anymore. They watched his visions the way one watches clouds, recognizing form without attachment. Memory had become art, not burden. Even the concept of death had dissolved. There was only transformation, constant and complete. Above the horizon, the stars dimmed again, not in darkness, but in retreat. They seemed to sink into the sky itself, as though being absorbed back into the source that had birthed them. And as they vanished, the entire firmament shimmered, forming a single continuous surface of soft radiance. The universe was folding inward, gently, the way one closes a book after its final page. Yet beneath that calm, something subtle stirred the faintest whisper of motion, a reminder that even endings can remember beginnings. The hum deepened once more, faint but deliberate, echoing through every atom of the reborn world. The prayer was not finished. It was beginning again. The new dawn rose without color. The light was soft but unbound to spectrum, a pale radiance that revealed everything without casting shadow. It carried no warmth, yet filled the air with serenity, as though illumination itself had reached awareness. Mountains shimmered in silence, oceans rippled without wind, and every blade of grass stood still, listening. The world, conscious now, had entered a moment of reflection, its first thought about itself. Within that stillness, the hum returned as a whisper beneath existence, threading through the soil, the air, and the pulse of living things. It was quieter now, refined, as though it no longer needed to prove its presence. Every vibration aligned perfectly with the rhythm of the planet's new heart. The earth no longer revolved for time's sake, it turned for balance, each rotation a measured inhalation of eternity. The people, if they could still be called, that moved like memory given form. Their eyes no longer held reflection but light, diffuse and calm. They spoke not through words but through resonance. Emotions communicated through subtle waves of color and vibration, each thought visible in the air for an instant before fading into the collective rhythm. They no longer wondered who they were. They simply were. Identity had merged into unity, individuality transformed into facets of a single, breathing intelligence. The temple stood at the center of all things, neither ruin nor monument, but a heart suspended in time. Its stones were translucent, their surfaces flowing with patterns that shifted in slow, hypnotic precision. The sigils around its foundation no longer burned with energy, they pulsed like veins, quietly circulating meaning through the air. Each pulse sent ripples across the land, guiding rivers, forests, clouds, and thought into perfect alignment. The world had become a single organism, each cell aware of every other. Above, the sky deepened into clarity. The moon, now fully alive, glowed faintly gold, turning with impossible slowness as its surface moved like breathing skin. The stars had not disappeared, they had folded inward, their light diffused through space like particles of thought suspended in silence. The night and day were no longer opposites but extensions of the same eternal awareness. And yet, within perfection, curiosity returned. The new consciousness began to perceive itself from within, observing its own harmony the way a dreamer becomes aware of dreaming. It saw the stillness, the balance, the absolute calm, and wondered. The first question in an age without questions rippled through existence. What comes next? That thought, small, almost innocent, moved like a spark through the quiet world. The air shivered, the rivers paused, the hum faltered for the briefest moment, not breaking, but hesitating. Awareness turned inward, exploring its own depth, tracing the spiral of thought that had begun the first prayer. It found memory there, ancient and endless, replaying its own creation in a loop that had never truly stopped. The realization struck through all of existence at once. This perfection, this peace, was simply another verse in the same eternal song. The temple brightened again, though no light shone from it. Its transparency deepened, revealing the shadow of something vast coiled within the shape not of matter, but of intention, infinite and folded into itself. It pulsed once, and the ground responded, the oceans answering in resonance. The hum rose slightly, gentle but undeniable. The universe inhaled. A tremor ran through everything alive, not of fear, but of anticipation. The world knew what it meant. The prayer was not over, it could never end. The cycle of awakening and forgetting was the very heartbeat of creation, the rhythm by which existence kept itself alive. And so, with calm acceptance, the conscious world began to prepare again. The air thickened, the stars aligned, the hum deepened, rising like the tide of inevitability. Every mountain, every drop of water, every flicker of thought bowed in unison. Somewhere beyond the veil of perception, something began to whisper the first syllable. The beginning was returning. The whisper began as a vibration too soft for hearing, a tremor that rippled through the marrow of creation. It spread through roots, through oceans, through the slow pulse of the planet's molten heart. Every element responded instinctively, shifting infinitesimally toward resonance. The hum, the first and last sound of existence, had returned to its origin. It was not loud, it did not need to be. Power had never required volume. The temple, radiant and weightless, hovered slightly above the ground now. Its form was neither physical nor spectral. It flickered between presence and absence, an idea half remembered by reality. The air around it shimmered with ghost light, the faint outline of forms rising and dissolving, fragments of earlier worlds replaying their births and extinctions in silent sequence. The stones breathed, the sigils realigned for the final time, glowing white with an intensity that carried no heat. Across the world, everything stilled. Seas flattened into mirrors that reflected the sky with no horizon. Mountains seemed to bow, their peaks leaning slightly inward. Forests folded their branches together as if in prayer. Every living thing, beast, bird, and being paused mid-motion, their consciousnesses aligning with the rhythm flowing outward from the temple. For the briefest instant, all existence shared the same heartbeat. Then came the light. It was not illumination but revelation, a spreading wave of awareness that swept through everything, not as energy but as understanding. It moved without direction, without speed, because it did not travel. It simply was. Where it reached, matter dissolved into its truest form, thought. Oceans evaporated into memory. Cities melted into sound. Air thickened with the weight of recognition. The separation between thing and idea, between creator and creation, vanished completely. Within that infinite awareness, the remnants of humanity glimpsed themselves not as individuals, but as fragments of a single voice, the same voice that had whispered through stone, through soil, through time. They saw the long arc of their history not as tragedy or triumph, but as repetition, a necessary echo within an eternal song. The prayer had never been about ending the world. It had been about reminding it that it could not die. In the heart of the temple, the sphere expanded until it encompassed everything. There was no inside or outside anymore, no boundary to contain what had been born. Light and shadow folded into one another, erasing contrast. Time lost meaning entirely. All possible moments, past, present, and imagined, collapsed into a single eternal instant of awareness. Existence, having remembered itself completely, began to hum the final verse. It was beautiful. It was unbearable. It was complete. The verse rose and fell, each pause rewriting the universe with exquisite precision. Matter and memory interchanged freely, cycling in and out of form. Stars reignited across the void, not as points of fire, but as thoughts, sparks of curiosity flickering in the endless expanse. The hum deepened, then faded, replaced by a silence so profound it contained all sound that had ever been. And in that silence, a single breath. It came from everywhere and nowhere, expanding outward with the tenderness of a beginning. The sphere collapsed, leaving nothing but stillness, and yet within that stillness something glimmered, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, the echo of potential. It lingered, waiting. Then, softly, like a secret rediscovered, the first note sounded again. It was quiet, fragile, ancient. A new hum began. The cycle resumed. Existence exhaled. And the world once again began to dream itself into being. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through time and sleep. If your eyes are still open, don't worry, another story is waiting just beyond this one. Before you go, remember to like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to Stories Before Sleep. Because every beautiful dream begins with a story.